All right, I think we're finally there. Okay, my apologies for the late start. Welcome to lecture 25 of Punishment, Culture, and Society. A warning to those of you watching online. Our last slide is going to click onto about a 6-minute video of a sort of restorative justice event, if you will. I'm not sure that's going to come across for those of you who are watching this on screen capture. If not, you'll be able to at least take the URL that will be in the slide and put it into your own browser, and then you can watch it. So hopefully we won't lose you at that point, because we're hopefully going to have a discussion afterwards. So what I want to do today is talk about restorative justice. When people think about the future of punishment in U.S. society, but also globally, especially when they express discontent at the state of our current policies of mass incarceration, they often point to restorative justice as the kind of thing that could move us away from mass incarceration, address some of the cultural and social needs that perhaps mass incarceration has responded to, but also perhaps change attitudes and beliefs that have supported it. When we look at restorative justice, though, as a global innovation, and we'll talk a little bit about its origins in a moment, one of the things that's rather striking is the United States is actually listed as one of the countries in which it has been most extensively tried out. And ironically, California, according to some sources, is one of the states in which there are the most active restorative justice programs. So you might find yourself thinking, well, how's that working so far, right? Restorative justice is part of the mix in the United States, but we're still seemingly very committed to mass incarceration. What exactly is going on here? And there's a little bit of a kind of wistful quality to the way people talk about restorative justice, as if it's a kind of secret sauce we could add to the things we already know how to do, like probation or parole or juvenile justice. Or, as is the case with many of the kinds of programs that have actually been implemented, they're really what criminologists would call net widening programs. That is, they've set up a restorative justice program in a high school to take care of bullying issues that never would have come to jail or criminal court probably to begin with, or at least not right away. And therefore, while they are a restorative justice practice of some sort, they're not necessarily reducing our commitment to mass incarceration. So the bigger question, the one I want to focus us on today, is whether there are some aspects of restorative justice that, either by being scaled up or by being part of a larger public discussion about how to fix criminal justice in states like California that are in crisis, that this bigger change that seems to be hoped for but has not yet arrived can be effectuated. Now, when we think about penal change, this is a good opportunity to begin to recap the course, really, because we are getting near the end. And mass incarceration is sort of the 800-pound gorilla that has been in the room, as it were, especially in California, but nationwide, and the United States is the leader in this, but other countries have at least taken some steps in this direction for decades now in the United States. And when you think about how to change it, this is a good opportunity to sort of see if your punishment and society toolkit, can do you some good. What will it take to change something that powerful that has a grip on that many institutions? When we think about the toolkits that we've used throughout the term to think about penal change and penal practices, they provide us with less with answers than with the kind of questions that we can begin to ask about essentially an empirical inquiry like this. How and under what circumstances can mass incarceration change? So let me take you back to, you might think about this in terms of sort of deep, long-lasting, perhaps unchangeable features of humanity. For instance, what appears to be pretty strong evidence that cross-culturally there's a pretty strong commitment by individuals to a retributive attitude to wrongdoers. There's all kinds of, as we saw at the very beginning of the course, psychology experiments that have documented this, or at least pointed to a phenomenon that, again, in experimental settings that may not strike you or me as perfectly natural extensions of the real world, but nonetheless suggest that there is something to this. Remember those experiments where people have no reward from imposing some kind of punishment on others, and yet they do it anyway, often if they feel like they've been treated badly, whether those are a perfect analogy for crime and punishment, put to one side. The point is, there's pretty good evidence that people have a kind of, dare I use the word, instinctual kind of, or at least hardwired at this point, sensibility that wrongdoers ought to be punished. But one thing we surely know by now is that perhaps evolutionarily developed, and some evolutionary biologists think that was that kind of sensibility, a desire to punish wrongdoers, could have actually improved the likelihood of our ancestors producing, surviving to produce eventually us. So that's how we would end up with a population that's sort of primed for punishment, if you will. But notice that, even in the last century of penal change that we've looked at, the shift from the, big house prison to the correctional institution, we saw the prison population sort of shrink in much of the 20th century, and now over the last 30 years, it quintupled. Well, I don't think we did anything evolutionary in that 30 years, right? Human beings didn't change their DNA in some radical way that we're aware of, at least. Nor is it the case that there was so much crime in the intervening years that essentially the same instinctual apparatus is just sort of produced more punishment because there was more crime to give it offense. Instead, as we've seen, we must look to cultural and historical and social factors to try to explain these variations. Yet, keeping in mind that when we want to talk about changing things, we have to keep in mind those instincts, those hardwired features. Because if people really not believe in a cognitive sense, but not in a reflective sense, but in a kind of hardwired sense that wrongdoers ought to be punished somehow, even though we know that how to punish them is very flexible. Who to punish can often be flexible. People can be convinced that someone's a wrongdoer. After all, in these experiments, they're not actually dealing with people they know, right? They're dealing with people that may not even be people. They may just be computer programs that they're playing against. So this is not a very precise function. And that is where we begin to look for other kinds of explanations. We need to take account of changes that can't be explained by evolution, but we have to keep evolution in the back of our mind, because if we want to change things, we have to think about how that sets a limit. It may be that it's just not possible, given that background, for us to come to, say, the public, right? We're democracy now, and say, let's change mass incarceration and replace it with a system of therapy and love for wrongdoers, a kind of institutionalization of turn the other cheek, right? I mean, that is a deep moral value in our society, indeed, of our religious, dominant religion, and yet you might predict, based on that evolutionary biology and that psychology, that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get people completely to say, oh yeah, wrongdoer, let me hug you. I really want to hug this person. Now, actually, I've been flippant about hug here, but I'm going to show you a video that's a pretty powerful video, and keep the thought of hug in mind before we get to it. Now, moving away from evolution, we've looked at sort of three major sort of areas or toolkits from social theory. And I just want to use these for a moment to think out loud with you about how those toolkits help us think about why mass incarceration has been able to endure for so long, despite plenty of evidence that it's not working very well. And my point here is not to just recap mass incarceration, but to have you and I thinking about how can restorative justice change those conditions, if at all? How can it, if these toolkits can help us identify the way in which mass incarceration is sort of anchored in our culture right now, in our political system, in our legal system, in our values, then maybe we can think about how restorative justice may or may not be able to, in some way, substitute for those functions that are now being served by mass incarceration. Right. So let's start with sort of Foucault. That is the broad idea that penal practices, whatever else they do, have an important role in constituting political authority and power. Sometimes it's the state, but sometimes it's also forms of private authority. Here are governors who are epitomize the state, as it were. And many scholars, we talked about this slide before, we have all the recent governors of California all backing essentially tough and fairly unrelenting prison sentences as a public policy in 2008, despite the fact that there was already a lot of evidence that the system was collapsing under its own weight. This is what some people have referred to as penal populism. Political authority in our time has become very dependent on appeals to people's sense of victimization and the idea that government can be a kind of tough sheriff. Partly this addresses, and this is the work I've tried to do in my book, Governing Through Crime, some of the structural crises or problems of American government since the 1960s. Some of those are rooted in our deeply flawed constitutional system, which have been on display over the last term or so in Washington in terms of the difficulty of actually making decisions. Governing is very hard, right? You win Parliament in the UK, you get to govern. Even if just by one vote, you get to govern. Here, being president doesn't really make you anything but somebody with some access to the TV camera, not a lot of direct power. And there's been a variety. I'm putting up some books here for your summer vacation reading, books that we've mentioned throughout the course that sort of explore the way in which mass incarceration and has rooted itself in the political culture of industrialized, post-industrialized societies like the United States and the United Kingdom in particular. Some of these analyses look more at the kind of national level, and others, like Josh Page's book, The Toughest Beat, looks here in California at the rise of the Correctional Officers Union and its ability to essentially turn the concern for victims into a kind of political platform around which to reshape state government and certainly prison policy. Part of this Foucauldian account puts a lot of emphasis on the rise of victims, and not just the rise of victims as if they were a pre-existing group, but the appeal of a victim identity to Americans since the 1960s for a variety of reasons. And again, I'm recapping stuff that hopefully has been part of the discussion so far. I should add to that, the Foucauldian account reminds us how available knowledge about crime is and awareness of our potential vulnerability to crime. And we talked about this, but if you want to learn something about your neighborhood, your school, your city, one of the things you can learn the most about on the web is crime, right? You can find sex offenders in your neighborhood through Megan's Laws. You can often find tables that show you the level of crime in areas, schools, all kinds of assessments in terms of their danger. So, and then that's not even to get into the media and the popular culture referencing of crime. So the Foucauldian perspective pays a lot of attention to both the needs of political authority, but also the structure of knowledge around that link together people's choices and their sense of vulnerability. We are hyper aware of our sort of crime vulnerability, and that's one of the features of any change in our penal culture we'll have to contend with. From the Marxist perspective, if you will, and I'm just using as my slide for that the very powerful statistics about the difference that class and race make to patterns of incarceration in mass incarceration. Marxist toolkit reminds us that whatever else it does, the penal system often mediates the deep kinds of conflicts that are produced by inequalities in society. And one of the things that has been undeniably documented by research is how deeply structured by class and by race absorption into the penal system is, with the staggering figure that if you're black and a high school dropout and you were a young adult, basically born in the 1975 to 1979 cohort, the odds are better than 2 out of 3 that you'll end up in prison. 2 out of 3. Now, it might seem bizarre, but this also reproduces inequality, right? The same kind of analysis can show that once you've been put through the penal system, your place on the bottom tier of the American economy is sort of permanently reserved for you. And while it may seem counterintuitive that public policies would have as their purpose to reproduce inequality, part of the Marxist toolkit, its job is to help us understand the way in which that can be, counterintuitive as it may seem, functional for society. We're a society that's going to have a lot of losers, and we're a very unequal society that produces some tremendous winners, a lot of losers. It may be a very important role of this system to provide a moral content to who the losers are. If we view the losers as people who have been involved in committing crimes and other wrongdoing, it may be easier for us to accept the kinds of inequalities that we live with. That's one of the reasons, this is a book I want to recommend by Alessandro Di Giorgi, Rethinking the Political Economy of Punishment, giving a global perspective. When you look around the world, it's not just the U.S. that has predominantly its racial minorities in prison. That's the pattern everywhere in the world. In Europe, it would be more commonly immigrants from North Africa and Africa itself who will end up in the penal systems or detention centers of countries like Italy. The Marxist perspective also reminds us of how powerful some of the political and economic interests are that get invested in incarceration. The Golden Gulag is a kind of Marxist geography of California prisons that shows how important it was, how important prisons were to balancing out some of the economic transformations going on in the 70s in public finance, in land values in the Central Valley, in the loss of value of urban labor in the big cities like Oakland and Los Angeles. And you can imagine from that point of view that the prison is a kind of solution to these very unbalanced economic conditions. The third framework that we have kind of recurred to throughout the course is a sort of Durkheimian framework. Durkheim reminds us that people's punitive response is anchored in their values and in their sense of social solidarity. The people we choose to punish are people who offend, either because we've seen them offend, do things that offend our deeper values, or because they're constructed by the media and by the legal system itself to stand in for the kinds of wrongdoings that we're most afraid of. And sometimes it's hard to tell. We have plenty of both in California's penal history, figures like Charles Manson or Richard Allen Davis, who can bring out, even 40 years after their crime, a tremendous, powerful, and no doubt emotionally sincere sense of both fear and a desire for punishment on the part of the public. But of course, part of the thing that Durkheim will remind us of is that modern society has a lot of values that have developed since sort of more traditional societies, including equality, including fairness, including rationality, and those are all values that the penal system, like it or not, has to produce. It can't just produce punishment. It also, in order to sustain its legitimacy, Durkheim would seem to suggest, it also has to show that it's equal, as I said, show that it treats people fairly, including offenders. I mean, if you watch sort of popular culture, we don't just see people committing crimes and then going to prison. In fact, most of what we focus on in our imaginary world of the television is the trial, right? Because the trial is very important to our sense of the justness and fairness of punishment. And again, here's some recent books that, in a sense, give us some insight into this Durkheimian, the kind of values at work in contemporary mass incarceration. Now, I want you to keep those in mind as we talk about restorative justice and the degree to which, if at all, it can be successful in helping move America and while some other countries have practiced mass incarceration. Certainly, very few or none are as deep as we are, but this has implications for other countries as well, certainly. And indeed, restorative justice is probably even more common, certainly in Australia and New Zealand, to some extent in Europe, than it is here. So let's talk a little bit about it. I asked you to read a short article by political scientist Albert Zur on the sort of democracy and political legitimacy issues around restorative justice. And if you're interested in restorative justice and learning more about it, I strongly recommend the recommended article by Carrie Menkel-Meadow, which was in the Annual Review of Law and Social Science. So here's a nice sort of, I think, definitional quote from Professor Menkel-Meadow. Restorative justice is the name given to a variety of different practices, including apologies, restitution, and acknowledgments of harm and injury, as well as to other efforts to provide healing and reintegration of offenders into their communities with or without additional punishment. So you often hear people talk about restorative justice as if it was a well-defined and very distinctive kind of penal practice. I think, as this quote alludes to, it's much more of a sensibility about the kind of features that punishment ought to have, and it actually gets employed in very different ways, in different settings. But some of those features are, there's a communicative aspect, the apology, as it were. Often this will take the form of a circle in which both the offender and the victim will speak directly to each other. There's often also representatives of the community, people who know both the victim and the offender, or some people who know the victim, some people who know the offender, others who know both, and maybe some who know neither but know the community. Part of the appeal of restorative justice is the idea that rather than seeing crime and punishment primarily as an issue between an offender and a state, that this reaches out to maybe a different but maybe even more powerful aspect of the harm crime does, which is the effect on individual victims, but also communities, right? When you hear about a really nasty crime in your community, even if you don't know the person it happened to, it changes your sense of comfort in your community. It may change your behavior in very real ways. It may, depending how old you are, how young you are, it may impose real harms on you. And if you're an older person without support in a city and you suddenly feel that you can't, say, use public transportation because of fear that you'll be, because of some nasty beatings or muggings of older people on a bus or subway, that's going to have a huge impact on people's lives. So part of what restorative justice is about is the recognition that these harms are real, and in very clear ways, our current penal system doesn't do much for them, right? So if somebody is charged with assaulting an older person on a bus, for instance, which could get them anything from an aggravated assault charge if there's an injury, or attempted murder even if there's some evidence that they were intending to gravely harm or kill them, to a relatively minor charge. But in any event, if that happened today, and it probably is somewhere, but in California, it's more than likely that that person would plead guilty after meeting with the public defender, and the public defender would meet with a DA, appear in court very briefly to enter that plea, and then disappear into the jail or prison system. The victim or the victim's family might glimpse them briefly in that court proceeding, may or may not have any opportunity to say anything, unlikely to have any opportunity to say anything to or exchange anything with in terms of communication with the offender. So much of the appeal of restorative justice is the idea that we could get out of that circuit in which crime and punishment are connected without very much role for the community. Not no role, right? Juries do once in a while happen, and that's the closest we have to a kind of community role. But by and large, something like 99% of all criminal convictions in America today done by plea bargain. One of the interesting things about restorative justice is that it's essentially perhaps the first really important penal trend in sort of the last 300 years or so to come primarily from the non-Western world, right? Going back to the invention of the penitentiary, the West has been fairly convinced that, as in so many areas, that it and only it had the answers to what successful societies ought to do. And the Western-style prison has spread itself all over the world. If you travel to Latin America, if you travel to Asia, you will see Western-style prisons. So that that's been a very successful export, if you will. Restorative justice is that rare import. It is anchored not just outside of the West, but very much in the global South, in traditionally less militarily advantaged and economically advantaged sectors. Again, this is from Menkel-Meadows. Other legal cultures she describes have long focused on restorative, reparative, or restitutionary forms of justice. Notice how contradictory that is to Durkheim's original idea that primitive, quote, primitive societies were all about retribution, and that modern society is more about restoration and reparativeness, restitution. The current evidence is that in many parts of the global South, let's not at all call it primitive, these practices of dispute resolution focused on reparation and restitution go back a long time indeed, and there's not really a story here of an evolution from repression to restitution, but perhaps the other way, to the extent that the West has been the more modern. These come from a number of the practices that have influenced the sort of global template of restorative justice come from a variety of places, including Africa. The Kachaka courts, there's an image of a Kachaka court in Rwanda, have received a lot of attention from socio-legal scholars, partly because in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocides, global justice began its creeping processes to try to bring some retributive justice to the leaders of that genocide. But people on the ground in Rwanda realized early on that if they wanted justice in their local communities, and if they wanted some way to reconcile with literally tens of thousands of their fellow countrymen who had participated in unspeakable crimes against them and their families, it would have to take some other form. And they looked back to traditional West African practice of Kachaka. And you can see, as in many restorative justice models, it's a circle. It's a public setting, but not the publicness of the court, right? If you go to downtown Oakland and walk a few blocks from the BART station at 12th and Broadway and make a right on, I think, 7th and go to the criminal court there right next to the police station, you can sit there all day and watch proceedings that are public, but they're not public like this. You're not invited to speak. You're sitting in the audience. Occasionally the judge will read out a bunch of names, and it's a very interesting thing to watch. But it's very different than this. Here's a conversation. Typically some of the elders or village leaders will preside, and what you often have is testimony, in a sense, but communication directly from perpetrators, from victims, with an emphasis on each one trying to explain to the other both the reasons and then the impact, the reasons for in the case of the offender, or an explanation for, not usually justification, but an explanation, and then learning from the victim what the crime and what the harm has really meant to them. Interestingly, at the same time, this has been growing as a model for handling sort of individual level criminal justice issues, as the Kachaka in Rwanda is an example of. It has also been seen as very important to national resolutions after tremendous conflicts, or let alone genocides like in Rwanda. One of the most famous examples is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was an attempt to basically create a restorative justice institution that could address what was essentially a 30-year-long civil war in which participants on both the African National Congress side and on the apartheid government side had committed innumerable human rights violations against each other. Certainly the bulk of those by the apartheid government, but there was certainly a lot of human rights violations in both directions. And it was Bishop Tutu led the effort between 1995 and 1998 to create an institution that literally went around the country and had essentially restorative justice meetings where people would come forward and give their testimony about their crimes. They would listen to victims. The incentive for doing that, and obviously an important question is, what's the relationship between these kind of restorative justice mechanisms and traditional retributive or deterrent incapacitation-oriented penal sanctions? In South Africa, it was very much of a substitution. If you agreed to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation process, you were actually given